Is suicide morally permissible? In this video, I'm going to be outlining reasons as to why suicide is morally permissible, and that denying this fact is a refutation of free will itself. Now, a quick disclaimer, this video is not an endorsement of suicide. I'm merely commenting on its morality, which is very different. I don't want to be responsible for any untimely deaths, so that's the disclaimer. Now, onto the argument. So, we're going to be looking at the arguments of David Hume as evidence of the acceptability of suicide, as he rebuts the moral implications of God, society, and the self. Now, these arguments are in direct opposition to Immanuel Kant's thesis on suicide's innate rejection of free will. I'm going to be presenting evidence that not only refutes Kant's claims, but proves that his argument is wholly contradictory in nature on his imperative for the retaining of free will. So firstly, Hume, in his essays on suicide and the immortality of the soul, he presents a negative argument against the three common criticisms of suicide. Now, his first reply is the common theological objection that suicide should be rejected on the grounds that God has created us, and doing so, by destroying ourselves, we would be denying Him. David Hume finds this interpretation of God very problematic. On the subject he writes, "Every action, every motion of a man innovates on the order of some parts of matter, and diverts from their ordinary course the general laws of motion. It would be no crime in me to divert the Nile or Danube from its course, were I able to effect such purposes. Where then is the crime of turning a few ounces of blood from their natural channel?" Now here Hume argues that we are created with the capacity to change the natural world. Just as we're able to change geographical facts, so too is equally morally unproblematic to change the state of our own existence. But critics of Hume, and there is critics, find this explanation unsatisfactory due to the implication on wider morality as a whole. They could argue that Hume's justification of moral actions in the natural world invites any action to be justified, only under the pretense of God creating us to be allowed to make our own decisions. Just as an example, a murderer might be justified in killing due to them acting on the world in their own way, which was orchestrated by God. However, in my opinion, this objection is not a fair one, due to the responsibility of the moral agent under God not to affect the moral agency of others. By murdering, a moral agent destroys the ability for another agent to carry out the rights bestowed on him by God. An action is only exempt from this moral judgment when it does not infringe upon another person's life and their ability to act. This also provides moral justifications for actions we commit towards ourselves. These ideas of free will of the moral agent over his own personal domain are very consistent with the modern socially accepted principles of free will and autonomy. Now, it's clear from this that Hume's theological justification of suicide does not affect any other person's ability to act, only the moral agent himself. Now, his second negative argument attacks the conclusion that to commit suicide is to abandon our responsibilities to others within our own society. Hume argues that when we commit suicide, we no longer have any responsibilities to society. This is because we only have responsibilities to society in tandem with what we receive. By committing suicide, we no longer receive from society and therefore are no longer obligated to provide. Hume even describes the life of someone in such depression that they cannot contribute to society but are still able to receive as serving the public interest in committing suicide. Admittedly, this can be problematic for Hume's critics. Kenneth R. Merrill, in The History of Philosophy Quarterly, writes, "By concentrating exclusively on situations in which responsibilities to society are non-existent or extremely weak, Hume sidesteps the issue. The plain fact is that, under the criterion of social utility, some suicides appear to be justifiable and others do not." Merrill states that Hume's argument based on his social morality is flawed. He makes clear that if someone who has behaved immorally commits suicide, then it's morally justified, but if a servant of society who has behaved well commits suicide, then it's an immoral action. It's clear that Merrill does misrepresent Hume's philosophy. By committing suicide, a moral agent who has served society well is not further denying society of their services. This would put an unfair obligation onto morally sound individuals, and that their debt to society is only so great because they previously given so much. If a morally sound agent commits suicide, he's not denying a society of anything other than a person who had committed such moral decisions during their life. Conversely, an agent who's lived an immoral life would be acting morally by committing suicide. This is not because they're denying themselves the opportunity to commit immoral actions in the future, but it's some kind of penance for their previous deeds. Ultimately, Hume proves convincingly that the fact that suicide does not inherently negatively impact society as a whole is therefore not immoral. Finally, the last negative argument that Hume uses to tackle the problem of suicide is the self. Hume makes clear that suicide does not do an injustice to oneself, and in fact can help us from escaping arduous and difficult lives. Hume explains that age, sickness, or misfortune may render life a burden and make life worse even than annihilation. Now this seems like a very contemporary observation, as he's noting the teleology of the action of committing suicide. Hume argues that it's possible that a life can be so miserable that death is very welcomed, through the deletion of worldly problems. For example, if a person has a debilitating chronic illness that stops the agent from experiencing any joy in life, suicide acts to stop suffering even at the expense of small amounts of happiness they might have experienced had they continued living. And as you may know, this is quite a modern concept, widely practiced in many countries, with the rise of organisations such as Dignitas. Clearly, Hume's negative arguments on suicide are effective in justifying its moral permissibility. Kant's normative ethical theory in regards to suicide is in stark contrast to Hume's. In his extract, Suicide and Duty, Kant uses his categorical imperative, you might have heard of it, as the base for his argument. This imperative is the basis for all of Kant's normative ethical positions. It states, "Act only according to that maxim whereby you can, at the same time, will that it should become a universal law." Foundationally, Kant uses this maxim to morally permit any action if all morally agents could equally commit to. And I will say, if you don't know much about philosophy, and you're looking for something to learn, a good place to get an introduction, Kant's categorical imperative is something you should really read on. It's a really good foundation, and it's one of the reasons why Kant is so successful, and he's still one of the most studied philosophers, 200, 300 years in the future. But anyway, digression. In the context of suicide, Kant takes this position that if every moral agent were able to commit suicide, there would be no one left to exist in the moral landscape, and so therefore suicide cannot be universalised. Kant would argue the whole question would be null and void if it were to be universalised, as the question relies on the existence of morality to function, and if everyone were to commit suicide, morality would thereby cease to exist. However, David Hume may have objected to this argument based on the false comparison Kant uses in his categorical imperative in relation to suicide. Kant's imperative functions well on the basis that the thing to be universalised would be inherently to the advantage of the moral agent and would be acted upon on an individual level if given the moral freedom. For example, the maxim, "it's acceptable for one to steal," is not universal, as, if everyone concluded it was morally permissible to steal, everyone surely would, as it's every moral agent's advantage to improving their quality of life. However, Hume would argue that theft is not comparable to suicide in this way. Suicide could never be universalised, as it's counterproductive to the betterment of most people's lives. Voltaire describes this intuition to live well. "I have wanted to kill myself 1,000,000 times, but somehow I'm still in love with life." This ridiculous weakness is perhaps one of our more stupid, melancholy propensities. It's clear that, even if given the option, most moral agents would refuse the option, as it's an intuitive reaction to every moral agent to live in this world. The number of people who desire to commit suicide is so low that there would never be risk to the moral space in which we live. It's clear to me that Kant would reply by saying that it's not the point of a maxim to be universalised, and that the morality of an action does not depend on if it will be universalised, but the fact that it can. It's clear to me, however, that if this is the case, the categorical imperative is flawed in relation to actions which don't necessarily benefit the moral agent in most cases. The willingness of the agent is absolutely relevant in the universality of a maxim, and therefore Kant's first argument is unconvincing regarding the impermissibility of suicide. The second argument Kant makes is equally unconvincing. Kant requires the free will to make moral decisions, and suicide would deprive us of the ability to make these decisions. Kant writes that animals lack the consciousness to make moral decisions. We, as moral agents, differ from animals because we treat things as objects to be acted upon, as opposed to objects ourselves. He states, "Man can only dispose over things. Beasts are things in this sense, but man's not a thing, not a beast. If he disposes over himself, he treats his value as that of a beast." Here, Kant is critical of suicide through its removal of the free will of the agent. He explains that by removing our free will, we would not be acting morally because we would be reducing ourselves to the consciousness of an animal. However, it's apparent to me that Kant creates a kind of paradox in saying this. Bear with me. Committing suicide is a unique and key part of our self-will. Generally, animals do not have the conscious capacity to commit suicide, unlike human agents. Although, perhaps by committing suicide, agents remove themselves from the moral space and their free will. Surely by not allowing us the option to commit suicide, we cannot have true free will. It's clear that if we do refuse the option of suicide on moral grounds, we cannot have free will, but if we do commit suicide, we deny ourselves of free will. This, to me, is a paradox that undermines Kant's logic and inserts doubt into his argument on the impermissibility of suicide. There's also a clear logical inconsistency in Kant's approach to self-sacrifice. On the topic he writes, "He who defends himself and his fellows, even unto death, is no suicide, but noble and high-minded." This weighing of moral severity is in contradiction to Kant's categorical imperative. The common thought experiment of refusing to help your friend escape a murderer by telling the killer the truth of his whereabouts is evidence of Kant's dogmatism in refusing to allow the categorical imperative to show concession to more conventionally moral actions. He writes unequivocally that the categorical imperative cannot be broken on an individual basis, even if it leads to a more conventionally moral outcome, as in the murderer thought experiment. However, Kant allows martyrs to commit he calls it self-killing, to commit suicide if they serve a conventionally moral purpose. This is inconsistent and represents Kant's uncertainty in dealing with the topic of self-sacrifice, ultimately making his overall argument less persuasive. If you've made it this long into the video, I'm very impressed. Very well done. I think that's an achievement. But we're at the conclusion now, so I think it's time that I kind of summarise my thoughts. So firstly, I think it's clear that Hume's negative arguments, it's very evident that he counters successfully the most intuitive criticisms of suicide. He attacks the fundamental objections of God, the self, and society, and combines theological determinism, utilitarianism, and free will to create what's, in my opinion, a very well-rounded argument, and it's quite difficult to object to. The objections to Hume are unconvincing and fail to support the original arguments that Hume's responding to. Conversely, Kant's moral theory, based on his own categorical imperative, fails in providing justification for his reasoning that suicide's morally permissible. The false applicability of his imperative, the paradox of free will, and the weighing of moral severity refutes Kant's arguments effectively and makes it impossible to accept his conclusion. Hume presents a more compelling and logically consistent argument, which is why it's clear that suicide is morally permissible. Now, again, I just want to say thanks for watching if you reached this point, and I hope that it made sense. But if it didn't, look up the key terms on Google, try and get a good understanding because it's really interesting. And at the end of the day, David Hume and Immanuel Kant are fundamental philosophers, and these theories, especially Kant's categorical imperative, have so much presence in philosophy even now that it's really useful to know and understand. And I can't wait to learn more about it. So again, thanks for watching. If you are interested in this type of content, please subscribe. There's going to be lots more videos on not only philosophy, but music and art and poetry. My favourite musical artists are Leonard Cohen and the Beatles, and as you know, if you're familiar with their work, there's lots of analysis to be done, and I'm really looking forward to doing it. And in the future, hopefully the videos are going to get a bit better. I'm always improving. So thanks very much, have a good day. Bye.